All right, so welcome everybody to our December Hangout. The title of this one is Paid and Unpaid Gallery Teachers, Pitfalls and Perks. My name is Juline Chevalier, and I am part of the Peer2Peer Hangout task force or working group. I'm sorry, I can't remember which one it is. Part of the NAEA Museum Education Division leadership team-ish thing, whatever names.
Own it.
This is a casual, casual event. Our new format or new schedule is that we are hosting these hangouts every month on the same day and time every month. So it is the second Wednesday of each month at 1 p.m. Eastern, which is 10 a.m. Pacific, and you can figure out if you're in the middle what your time is. And we're just really excited to have this opportunity to share ideas and generate conversation. The impetus for this whole program was the great conversations that we end up having at the NAEA National Conference and wanting to continue that. So before I even have our participants introduce themselves, I'm going to ask those who are viewing to use the Q&A feature. If you mouse over your screen, you'll see a little menu or a menu on the left. And the Q&A bubble is like a speech bubble with the letters Q&A in it. And if you could use that to type what you hope to get out of this hangout today. We want to make sure that we're at least attempting to address the things that are important to you. So thinking about paid and unpaid gallery teachers, so unpaid being usually called docents, and paid taking a variety of names. At the Nasher Museum, where I currently work, it's gallery guides. So I'll give folks a couple of seconds to type in what they hope to get out of the session. And while we're waiting for people to do that, actually, I'll have folks introduce themselves. Jessica, I'll have you start.
Great. Hi, I'm Jessica Sack. I'm the Senior Associate Curator of Public Education at the Yale University Art Gallery. And I'll be talking a little bit about our Gallery Teacher Program, which is a paid program for graduate students at Yale that's been around for 10 years now.
Awesome. Erin, can you go next?
Sure. I'm Erin Branham. I'm the manager of school programs at the J. Paul Getty Museum in Los Angeles. And over the last couple of years, we have gone through a transition from paid gallery teachers to a large docent corps. So I'll tell a little bit about that transition.
Excellent. And Jeanne, please.
Hi, I'm Jeanne Hoel. I'm Associate Director of Education at the Museum of Contemporary Art, where I specifically oversee school and teacher programs, and I'm going to be sharing results from our 2013-14 major survey that we conducted with help from the field into questions about paid educators and docent systems, who's satisfied, what are the benefits, and what are the costs in comparison.
Great, great. Thank you all so much. So if folks continue to join us, thank you so much and welcome. What I'm asking everyone to do first of all is to type into the Q&A feature what you hope to get out of this Google Hangout. So we're talking about paid versus unpaid gallery teachers. What are you looking to see here? When I used to lead a volunteer docent group, I was interested in the data that was out there to support transitioning to a paid system. So maybe some of you are interested in that. Tell us what you're into and what you want to know. I haven't seen anything yet, so we'll go ahead with our format. We're just going to have Jessica and Erin speak briefly about their point of view going from unpaid to paid and paid to unpaid, respectively. Jeanne is going to fill us in with some of her great research and kind of the data that connects to both of those points of view. So Jessica, I'll let you go ahead.
Great. So I'm trying to think about how to start this story a little bit. The Yale University Art Gallery had a docent program in place for quite a while, and it had an undergraduate gallery guide program, which was I call it an extracurricular program for students to learn how to give tours. And in 2005, we began to think about what would it mean to really consider ourselves a teaching museum, and what would it mean to then be able to help train the next generation of those who would be teaching in museums. And so when that happened, we started the Gallery Teacher Program, which is a paid program for graduate students who are from a variety of fields, who work with us 10 to 15 hours a week and teach school groups, special needs groups, and some adult groups. And then in 2009 and 10, we decided that we wanted all of our teaching to be done by students who were trained by us to teach. And we turned our docent program into an emeritus program where they are still given the title of docent but do not have any of the responsibilities they did before. So we currently now have 17 graduate students who are teaching 10 to 15 hours a week, and we are able to pay them and we train them, and the emphasis for us then has become that as a teaching museum, we are really focusing on what it means to teach, what it means to learn, and those who are doing the teaching are also then one of our audiences. So that's sort of the general description of what we do, and I'll go into more of the details later. Erin, did you want to follow up on your sort of the reverse for yours?
Absolutely. At the Getty, the change from paid gallery teachers to docents was really driven by a desire to be able to offer more guided lessons for our school groups, and it's been very successful in that way. It's allowed us to pretty much double the number of guided lessons that we are able to give to our visiting school groups. With the paid gallery teachers, we were able to hit about 33% of our school audience that visits the museum, and now we're at over 60% receive guided lessons. A lot of the, we're in a unique situation with the docent program because most docent programs are very established and have 20, 30, 50, 100-year histories, and ours has 3. So we're entering, just about to intake our 4th class. So it's unusual in that way, in that we really get to look at the field, look at all the best practices, and build a program from scratch, and think about sort of all of the main thing that I've noticed is really different is the logistics of it. Recruiting and training and maintaining quality with a group of professional paid gallery teachers is sort of one kind of thing to do, and then to do it with volunteers and docents is a completely different animal. So that's what we deal with in the transition a lot, is sort of how to organize or how to create systems that you need in place to support volunteers, which is very different from the support that you need for paid gallery teachers.
Excellent summary, Erin. Thanks. And so we'll turn things over to Jeanne to give us some of the background of her research and findings.
Okay. Hopefully you can hear me. Just flag me if you can't. This research was conducted in January, and we gave a preliminary report at the conference in February. And in the journey of learning how to become a researcher practitioner, this has been a very rich experience. And I could say that I learned in February when we shared our data, we just had so much data that had really yet to be culled and simplified and made sticky and useful. And so the final report is still being generated, and we will send that out and have that available before the next NAEA conference. But in the meantime, I'm finding that a little bit of time from the data has helped us see it a little bit more clearly. So I'm happy to share with you today what will hopefully be some useful findings from that. And if you can't see the screen, Juline, can you see that?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. So I'm just going to walk you through about 10 slides of basic findings. To give you a sense, we surveyed 66 museums in all. Thank you to everyone who participated. It was a very long survey. 62% of our participants came from all volunteer museums. 24% had hybrid systems, which is a combination of paid and volunteer educators, and 14% had all paid systems. So we collected qualitative and quantitative data, and I'm going to be sharing highlights of the qualitative data here. And the quantitative data was sort of the big bear of it all. It is still being crunched, and for that we were looking at data and breaking it down by institutional budget size so that it might be easier to compare apples and apples. Includes the numbers of people toured, the number of people toured, how many volunteers and paid educators they have, the amount of supervision required, and additional costs. I have a few things I can share about that in big picture. But first, I will start with our qualitative data and what we asked people. So here are 5 major areas of questions that we asked people. What do you want students and adults to take away from your tour experiences? How well do you feel your volunteers and or paid educators deliver on those?
Can you hear me?
Yeah?
Yeah, I'm sorry. Just wanted to give you the heads up that the slides are being a little bit slow. So we're not seeing that yet, but don't worry about it. Just keep telling us.
Okay. I will be visually illustrative in my language. And I will just put these slides up and start talking, and I think that they should all appear before I finish. So the first question, again briefly, what do you want people to take away from their tour experiences, and how well do you feel your staff or volunteers are delivering on that? The second one is, what kind of teaching do you want to see? How well do you feel your volunteers or paid educators meet those expectations? Thirdly, what are ideal characteristics of volunteers and paid educators for you, and how well do you feel your folks measure up? Fourth, what do you think motivates your volunteers or paid educators to work at your museum? Fifth, how satisfied are you with the current system you have? And then lastly, there are 6 actually, why do you use the system that you use? Okay, so here's what we learned. First of all, when it comes to students, with their tour experiences, 100% of respondents said they want Common Core learning outcomes to be supported. This includes communication, critical thinking, and peer-to-peer discussion skills. And among that, our data showed that paid educators are out-delivering volunteers 15 to 50% in terms of supporting those outcomes successfully. Second, museums said they wanted to see an expanded personal understanding of art and positive experience with museum personnel that humanizes the museum. These were both tied for second, and in this case, all paid educators outperformed their volunteer counterparts by 30%. Yes, the same thing about adults. Ranked first was, for adult outcomes, was a positive experience with museum representatives that humanizes the museums. And in this case, all paid educators outperformed volunteers by 50%. When it comes to expanding art historical understandings, the second most desired outcome, paid and volunteer staff were delivering on that roughly equally. Another and third goal was inspiring people to return to the museum, and in that case, volunteers outperform their paid counterparts 20%. Okay, what kinds of teaching do you want to see? Inquiry-based teaching, including VTS, was the first priority for almost every museum we surveyed for both student and adult tours. For students, we learned people reported that their volunteers and paid educators are delivering roughly the same on that desired outcome. For adults, volunteers are out-delivering their paid counterparts by 10%. Although I do have to add a little parentheses that this seems contrary to anecdotal evidence. To be honest, from what I've heard, I often hear that is encouraging people to use inquiry-based methods is very challenging, and particularly so in the case of docents. So just a side question on that. Second, people said they wanted to see consistent instruction among tour providers. And in this case, paid educators outperformed volunteers by 15% for students and 10% for adult groups. Okay. What are ideal characteristics of volunteers and paid educators? Respondents said that they first valued the ability for docents or paid educators to be visitor-centered. In this case, paid educators outperformed volunteer counterparts by 50%. In flexibility, second most desired characteristic, paid educators were up 15%. And thirdly, the ability to get with the program in terms of how education departments want their tours to be conducted, paid educators are up 10%. So we asked, what do you think motivates volunteers or paid educators to work at your museum? And tied for first priority for both paid educators and volunteers is the desire to contribute to museums' missions and because of their commitment to informal education. Paid educators and volunteers answered, rated roughly the same on this, 40% and 30% respectively. The next priorities for volunteers in terms of their perceived motivations were to be part of a community of peers, to gain peer status, and to gain art historical knowledge. The next top priorities for paid educators were to earn wages, to gain teaching skills, and because of their commitment to progressive education. Side note, I think these first three for volunteers are interesting in that they are largely social and informational, and so they're more focused on the volunteers themselves and what they can get out of the experience. How satisfied are you with the current system you have? Very satisfied. All paid museums systems, 15 to 20% more said that they were very satisfied. And primarily the reasons for this were the quality of instruction and the reliability and accountability they could expect from paid educators. 100% of all paid systems answered either very satisfied, satisfied, or partially satisfied. And 75% of hybrid and all volunteer systems answered similarly. And the primary reasons for their answers for hybrid and all volunteer museums was cost effectiveness and quality of instruction. So there were 25% of hybrid and all volunteer museums who said that they were dissatisfied or partially dissatisfied. And the primary reasons for this were, quote, the negative power of tradition and lack of instructional consistency across providers. Why do you use the system that you use? For paid systems, the three reasons cited tie in priority: higher quality of instruction, professionalism, and the boost it provides to the public image of the museum. For volunteer systems, the three highest cited priorities were cost effectiveness, power of tradition, and to provide a meaningful program for adult stakeholders who want to volunteer. So basically we're seeing that paid educator programs are outperforming volunteer programs in terms of quality of instruction, professionalism, consistency of instruction. When we look at the qualitative data in just a quick big picture, we see that hybrid museums are serving the most visitors. They serve more visitors than all paid systems and all volunteer systems. And also, it seems that the amount of supervision required across all three of these systems is proportionally equivalent to the number of visitors toured. However, this does not include initial orientation trainings. So again, the amount of supervision that each system accords to their volunteers and or paid educators seems to be roughly equivalent based on how many people they serve. And that is the end of my report.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jeanne. So now we're going to turn things over to Let me stop screen sharing on mine. Da, 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 da. All right. So let me pull up our Q&A. So that's a really great overview of all of these, the different ways that things can go and some of the data to back it up. And one thing that I just want to point out about your research, Jeanne, is that it's self-reported. So it's the full-time museum staff saying how much they feel that their gallery teachers do XYZ and how successful they are. And I think that's, the best way to start, absolutely. But it's not that external evaluation of it. So just to keep that in mind, it's not good or bad. It's something to think about. I also thought one thing that I'm curious about is I wonder if that, because of that, the curious finding that you reported that the volunteers did more inquiry or were better at it, I can't remember exactly what it was, did more inquiry than the paid people. I wonder if that's related to expectations. Is that those of us with paid programs expect folks to be using it all the time, and if they don't, then that's a deviation, whereas with volunteer docents, you maybe don't expect it as much.
Yeah, it brings up a lot of questions because it is not, what would you call it, more formally researched in terms of how people are actually performing according to these expectations. But I think that might be a useful finding in and of itself, is that we don't know often how well people are actually delivering on these outcomes. And we might find we actually do want to know that in a more quantitative way. That's important for our for our work.
One thing that I am noticing coming up, I'm going to collect Chantal Lane's question because I think it's a great question for Jessica and Erin of, do you find any difference in feedback from your visitors, whether it be teachers chaperoning students or public tours? Get anything? I'm sorry, I am not answering the right question. The question was, I can't find it anymore. But the question was, was there any feedback from the public when that transition happened, quality, quantity, etc.?
We do an annual teacher survey, so we do ask our teachers to give us some feedback, and we really didn't see a whole lot of difference in terms of how they felt the quality, whether they were very satisfied with the quality of their guided tours. We had a much bigger sample size when we did it with the docent-led tours because more people were taking the guided lessons. But the response was relatively equal. We got the occasional long-term teacher who'd been coming for a long time, who knew what was happening when we transitioned, may have had their favorite gallery teachers, and believed in that, in the philosophy of having paid teachers who would say, oh, it's not. We give them an opportunity to put comments. So we do get the occasional sort of random comment about that, but the statistics are pretty consistent. So it still runs around 80–83% of people being satisfied or very satisfied with their guided lessons.
We haven't formally evaluated or looked at these questions, but what we have found is that our attendance overall for K-12 teaching tripled from when we had the volunteer program to when we had the paid program. In addition, the teacher feedback from the people coming in was that they really appreciated the fact that the people who were doing the teaching in the museum saw themselves as teachers and were taking the opportunity when working with the students to see it as a lesson versus a tour. And by that I mean the gallery teachers, when they're working in the gallery, are really thinking about ideas of inquiry and looking and learning, while previous models, it was much more about sort of greatest hits, walking through lots of spaces, a very different philosophy, which was hard to retrain or overcome. So the shift for us from volunteer to paid also was a shift in the way teaching itself was done. So they're hard to compare the two together for that reason as well. But I would say that given the return and the fact that so many of the people with whom we work from the outside are developing longer-term collaborative relationships with us, that things are working well, and there's a great symbiotic relationship between the outside classroom teacher and the internal gallery teacher.
Great. And I will give credit now. I finally found it. It was Kelly Williams who answered the question.
Yeah, that's very interesting about you saying, there's a change in the approach to teaching, because that is something that, again, is sort of unusual in our case because our docent program is so new. It was built on top of the foundations of a long-term paid gallery teacher program, and so the model of teaching, including the structure of the tours, is exactly the same as it was with the paid gallery teachers. So it's 4 stops, 15 minutes at each stop, really looking closely at works of art. All of the philosophical underpinnings are the same, and we train our docents using those same principles. You get a broader range, I think, of quality of instruction, but we went from 15 paid gallery teachers to 150 docents. So some things are going to be different when you have that big of a change of scale. And it certainly, like I said, makes a big difference in sort of how we approach training and the basic material. I mean, I was literally taking notes over here that, like, this issue of the visitor-centered approach, I need to make sure that's part of my docent training, that they understand what that means. If you don't, that's the kind of things that you have to think through, that we are finding is things that you can sort of take for granted with professional gallery teachers. They're going to walk in with a baseline understanding of how to do art historical research, how to structure a tour, what good informal education pedagogy is, what a visitor-centered approach is. These are all things that you have to prepare and teach your docents, because they're coming in from all walks of life. They may not know anything about museum pedagogy or philosophies of teaching in an informal institution. So as long as we prep them correctly, give them that information, then you have a better springboard to work from. But we have the advantage of building our program right now.
Right.
That's not the case in a lot of places.
One of the other things that we found that is unrelated to sort of the student visitor-centered side of it is that by paying people, we were able to diversify the teaching pool in a way that if it was volunteer only would not be the case. That students who financially, our teaching staff who are students, those who financially could not volunteer the time because they need to be working, by having it be a job, it allowed it to open it up to a much broader range of people who could then apply for it. And I'm wondering, and I recognize that in the broader world, the funding of things is one of the possible limitations, in addition to a whole lot of other things. But the idea that we pay people to do things as opposed to volunteer to do things, I think allows us to tap into different stages of people's lives and also what they're able to or not able to do at those times.
I think that that's an important point, and one question that we asked on our survey in 2007, but somehow amid the 1,652,000 questions we asked in 2014, we did not ask people how important it was for them for their teaching staff to reflect the socioeconomic and cultural backgrounds of their visitors. And that was an oversight, but something that in 2007 people indicated was very important.
There's a question.
And paying will make that possible in a lot of cases.
Right. There's a question on the sidebar here. I think Juline's been frozen out. It says, are there any examples of paid gallery teachers coexisting with volunteer gallery teachers at the same time? Any success challenges surrounding this format? And I think this is a question coming in from Chelsea.
Could I speak to that briefly?
Yes.
It makes me realize I could make that a little bit more clear in the findings. We looked at museum educator systems that had all volunteer systems, all paid, and then hybrid museums, which are a combination of both paid and volunteer. So we have results, and for the most part, there are some unique findings for hybrid museums, but in general, the results seem to fall out pretty much across paid educators and volunteers, even when they're in the same system.
And from the experience I've had at different institutions, I think it also depends on. I think primarily it depends on sort of the working culture of the institution. So if the volunteers and the educators work well together, having two systems works well. If they don't work well together, it's slightly problematic. So there's sort of a basic logic to that. But I do see systems like the Brooklyn Museum where they have a very strong docent gallery, a volunteer gallery guide program, and their museum education program. Those programs coexist beautifully, and other places too. So I think that they can exist, and that what ends up happening in a lot of cases is that the goal of the teaching or the goal of the learning experience is slightly different for each of the teaching practitioners, and that helps sort of differentiate what's happening in each area.
It seems also that a lot of times museums that have both systems of paid and volunteer museums may have started out with an all-volunteer docent corps, but then found they needed to maintain higher levels of accountability or just regular hours and professional commitments from people, as well as higher accountability, perhaps higher levels of instruction, and so have concomitantly a group of paid educators working with their, say, school groups.
I'm looking through the questions in the sidebar. Erin, go ahead. I'm sorry.
I've looked through there. There are several people who are interested in this, the hybrid model, and I should say that at the Getty, while there has been sort of a lot of public focus on the fact that we moved from paid to unpaid, not all of our gallery teachers went away. So technically, I guess we have a hybrid system. We've maintained 5 of the gallery teachers who are now called gallery educators, and their jobs have transitioned over the course of the last 3 years significantly, of course, because they used to do all the gallery teaching. Now they do a great deal of docent training. So again, there's a kind of a consistency between the system we had before and our approach to teaching and how the docents are being brought in and trained. And they also do still some special gallery programs. They're different across the 2 sites, sort of what exactly they do. But that is kind of an interesting model for, and I know that some other museums have that as well, where there's a staff of paid gallery teachers who do a sort of certain set of teaching and then also train the volunteer teachers as far as, because some people were asking about sort of what are the roles and how do they relate to each other. So I wanted to throw that in.
Erin, could you tell us a little bit I'm interested also, people are asking in the sidebar about what our trainings look like for these different systems. Since you got to invent a volunteer program and really think about what training would look like, I know in our preparatory conversation, one of the things you were discussing is that the staff that used to do the teaching came in with a very specific set of skills, and the new group that's doing the teaching is slightly different, and that has also played out in the way you've been thinking about what is necessary for training.
Definitely. It's just that thing of having to think through all the basic information that you might expect someone who you hire is going to have a certain level of understanding that, especially since our paid gallery teachers generally had master's degrees, either in art history or museum education or museum studies. So they really walked in with a high level of knowledge. Our volunteers, of course, many of them come out of the classroom. Many of them are retired teachers, but many of them are from all variety of walks of life. So it's thinking through giving them that basic understanding as well as the content information. And we, because our transition happened very quickly, we have been developing the training and then refining it and refining it and refining it every year. So it's looked a little bit different year to year, and then we're also trying to build the right support systems. For instance, we're developing an online docent manual that docents, it's a wiki, so docents can actually contribute their own research to it, their own teaching ideas, a way for them to communicate and share with each other beyond their shift. You know, there's a tendency for docents to talk to people they see every day or every week that become their sort of little family group. But this is a way to make sure that information circulates around the core and across the sites. We have the two sites, but we use the same teaching philosophy at both of them. So there's been a lot. I mean, I think that quality teaching is achievable under both systems, but they're extremely different in terms of what the approach is to how you get to that quality. So that's a lot of what we've thought about over the last few years, and that's a really big goal over the next couple of years, is to make sure that we are training properly for that high quality teaching, that we're giving the docents all the tools that they need to really be able to achieve that. And then what's the support system beyond the initial training? What's the continuing education? What's the observation and feedback system that you have in place? How do you create peer-to-peer observation and feedback so that they're helping each other become better at what they're doing? So it's a lot of really thinking through how everybody relates to each other. You know, paid gallery teachers, they certainly do a lot of that, but there's a lot more independence, I think, for them individually.
It's really interesting. I've been thinking about Jeanne's research and also looking at what we have been doing here. One of the things we've been looking for when we've been hiring people is finding people who have some teaching background, but their art history isn't going to be, or their understanding of art history isn't going to be the thing that we're looking for as dominantly as it had been under the old version of looking for people. We're trying to find people who are kind, who interact well with others, who are adaptable in different ways, and then the content and the pedagogy we feel can come as part of the training. And that's had us shift, and it's also had us shift the way we even interact with our curators and other teaching staff in the way we approach training and thinking about what do we need to fill in around the people that we now have so that they all end up with a similar understanding of what content could look like, what interactions could look like, and how you sort of adapt to your own needs and still fulfill the expectations of the audience coming in.
And then Jessica, since you're dealing with students primarily, do you have a lot of turnover in your paid gallery staff? Is that right?
Yes and no. I ask for a 2-year commitment, and the graduate programs here tend to be 2 years and on, so it includes the professional schools. I have people working with me that are in public health, history of art, architecture, photography, psychology, all different sorts of fields, divinity school, and some are staying 5 or 6 years, which in museum education world is sometimes the average length of an employment stint at a museum. And we're finding that the people who work with us end up going on to careers that incorporate the museum or teaching as part of what they do. Even if it's going on to medical school, it's thinking about how to interact with patients and things like that. So it's been very interesting to see sort of the long-term effects, now that we're 10 years out, of what it means for a student to have the opportunity to teach. I think that if I were not at a university museum, one of the questions on the side here is what could we do if we're not near a body of students. I do think that there are many people in communities who are interested in teaching and interested in working with the public in various ways. And I find that those people tend to be really good at teaching in museums. It's those who come in saying that I'm, an expert in X or Y, but not necessarily who are the most interested in the people they're going to work with, who have a harder time adjusting to teaching in a museum space. And I do think that there are a lot of people who are looking for part-time employment. The trick is going to be within institutions figuring out the funding, the way to fund things, because that I think is what at the upper levels are sort of the barriers. And for us who are implementing things, being able to justify what it means to start a program and what the costs could be.
I don't know if people can see and hear me again.
Hi.
Hi. Sorry about that. I mean, the other thing that you may have already mentioned while I was away, but just to tag on to what Jessica was saying is, thinking about the costs you should not just include the salary of the gallery guides or the paid tour givers. Be sure to include the cost of the time of the full-time educators who are spending their time training and, you know, feeding and caring for and celebrating volunteers. And as volunteer professionals, they deserve those things, but it takes a huge amount of time and energy. And when we were transitioning from volunteer to paid, I calculated that 2 full-time staff members were spending 20% of their time working with our docents. And that's a huge amount of salary that, if you think about that, just going to cover the hourly wage for the gallery guides, and then our time is freed up for other things.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think it's important to think about cost in that way. Also, the amount of supervision it takes, how often orientation trainings take place, and how extensive those need to be, in addition to ongoing supervision, and the ability to track and measure the quality of a fewer number of people who do more tours than hundreds of people who give a few tours, and our ability to track quality. But also, I think an unmeasurable cost is how much time we spend kvetching about teaching in the galleries. I think that's a lot of resources right there if we're talking about a system that we feel is not working or delivering what we want it to. Just for the record.
One of the what I've also been finding interesting, also from Jeanne's data, but also just in talking to colleagues, is the issue of availability with volunteer. So how many people do you need to have the number of hours covered that need to be covered? We found that by making a requirement of the job that people be available for X amount of time, and that they not be available as a requirement of the job, helped us immeasurably, because we can just schedule people and expect them to be there and show up for that. And it's harder to ask somebody who is truly giving of their time. It becomes like asking for a favor. For us, it felt like asking for a favor, as opposed to saying, we're so glad that we have this relationship where we know by asking you it's actually part of the working relationship. And I'd be interested in knowing, Erin, how you are handling, or how you're with the large number you have, and also the large number of groups happening. Are you finding that it's possible to create expectations like that, and are they easily fulfilled by the people who are doing the teaching?
We have a pretty clear set of expectations for all of our docents in terms of how many hours they will do, how committed they are to their shifts, how long what a commitment they make, which is 2 years, once a week. I deal primarily with school group docents, but we also have general public gallery docents and site docents who do architecture and garden tours. So those people are committed year-round to a particular thing, and then the school group docents, of course, just during the academic year. But you cover your shift. If you can't cover your shift, then you get a sub, and we are instituting now, because we finally have enough time in our pocket to do a sub pool. And if you miss even a few shifts and don't get them covered, then you're below your hourly commitment. And so I think having that set of expectations, you tell them that on the front end, during the intake, during the interview, and then people self-select in terms of their availability. We really do not have much problem with people not showing up.
That's great.
When I've worked at smaller institutions, it's different. You don't have as many options. You don't have as big of a pool of the public to be involved. You don't have the cachet. It's that part of it is there is something to, I am a docent at this, big prominent museum, as opposed to I am a docent at a museum in a smaller community where people, half the people in town know it's there. So I've noticed that it's because I've run docent programs at much smaller institutions. There's a big difference there, and there's the need of warm bodies sometimes. We've got groups coming in. Somebody's got to take them, and that changes your intake process. The ability to be selective is very important, and it's something I think that comes with a paid program in a lot of ways. That you have a clear thing to offer, so you get some competition going on. It's not always that way for docent programs. It can be. I think that's part of thinking through a docent program is building a level of cachet to it. And to be honest, in my opinion, the more rigorous it is, the more you build that. So I think when people feel like, well, we have to be easy on our volunteers, that can actually, it's counterintuitive, but it can actually work against that, to say that you have a really clear expectations, really, this many hours and you must be here, and that kind of expectation helps to build the program, helps the pride and commitment of the volunteer as well.
I see another question on the sidebar that is, I think, interesting to look at. It says, do any of these programs guarantee a certain number of hours for paid gallery teachers? Our tours are not always steady, so it might be difficult to pay hourly and ensure a constant wage for part-time employees. And I think that's also probably a good question for volunteer as well. What is the commitment, and how does that play out? On our end, if there isn't, so we're asking 10 to 15 hours, and if people have less time available, we keep that into account when we are scheduling them. But we also consider part of their work the research that they do, the preparing for teaching, observing each other, peer evaluation, and that sort of thing. So we do find that if there are lulls in teaching, there's plenty of time to be working on things related to teaching, whether it's development of activities, you name it. So we are able to find ways to have consistently predictable hours, but what happens in those changes throughout the year depending on what's happening in the school system and also what's happening with demand.
And I'll jump in and say that we've had similar results. We do ask for that minimum commitment, and there are people who are, I would say, for 95% of our participants, they're not doing it for the money. I have a couple who are, and so we know that they want to do as many tours as possible, and so we schedule them as such, and because they also have a more flexible schedule. We just haven't run into that occasion where people are talking about leaving us because there's not enough work for them. So depending on how slow is slow, that may depend on the size of your institution and the kinds of exhibitions that you have. There have been a lot of questions on the side about hybrid programs, and I didn't know, Jeanne, if you've already spoken about them before while I was in Frozen Land, or if there's other points that you want to address with that. There's lots of questions. I know we don't have anybody on air right now who represents a hybrid program, but maybe some of the things that you've discovered either in the extended comments of your surveys or conversations with folks.
Not in particular. I feel like right now I'm working in the slightly broader strokes of paid and volunteer, which includes systems that include all paid staff and all volunteer programs, as well as those that have the combination. I just think perhaps it's most interesting to point out that hybrid institutions with hybrid systems are touring the most visitors, and that ultimately I'm seeing this data as becoming looking at quality, numbers served, and perhaps just those two at this point as the decisions that we need to make as educators. What is more important to us institutionally? Is it serving people? Is it cost? It's the third. And quality. And I don't think they're ever mutually exclusive, but it does seem that museums that work with volunteers are able to serve more people, but I wonder if that means it's incumbent upon us as educators to make the case for quality, if in fact that is important to us, if we're faced with challenges from those other two sectors.
Looking at a question here that says they're curious about paid to unpaid transition and keeping a balance between having both types of positions that have similar jobs. That is something that we did go through, and I think I mentioned before that we do still have some of the people who were the former gallery teachers who became gallery educators who actually oversaw the transition. There definitely was, there was just a lot of flux that was going on at the time and trying to redefine those positions as well as get the docent corps up and running. It has settled out somewhat now, but this has been a transition that's gone on for 3 years. So it certainly can be done. There is a level of awkwardness that comes along with it, but it did sort of work out in the end, I guess would be where I've come out with. Everybody has found their place, redefined their jobs. That's a process that continues. And the gallery educators, I think, have still see themselves as the stewards of our gallery teaching, since they are so heavily involved in training and providing observations and feedback to the docents. But it's definitely a real shift in thinking, because it's one thing to work directly with the public, it's another thing to then step back from that and be the person who's to think about training the person who's going to work for the public, who's going to interact directly with the public.
Just to point out, I see a number of questions asking if this data will be shared. Perhaps, Juline, you can confirm this has been uploaded into the Google Hangout and therefore I believe is accessible for download.
This being the PowerPoint portion.
This being the PowerPoint, correct.
And Jeanne, aren't you also presenting updates at the next conference proper as well?
I'm not. There isn't a session scheduled to discuss them, but that's okay. That's okay. But the hope is that report will be the report will be made available to people before, and maybe there will be a stack of hard copies at the conference.
Well. There's another question I think would go for you all. We currently have volunteer docents who are interested to know what justification you give to your docents when trying to transition to paid gallery teachers. How do you break it to them?
Yeah, so that's a tricky one. In our case, because we're a teaching institution and we have a teaching hospital and there are all these parts where we're trying to have the students that are part of the university learn the skills, we were able to explain to them that we were going to be focusing on having students do all of the teaching. I think if we were to be creating a non-student-based teaching audience, teaching group, that we would have encouraged them to apply for it and then to have been, if they were selected, to have been part of a paid group then. But it was not an easy transition. It was actually a 2 or 3 part transition. The first was that when the gallery teachers started, the docents were promoted to being to work only with adults, and then 8 years later, then the program was turned into the emeritus program, and their duties were officially discontinued. And the result was tricky. Some people felt very hurt. Some people were upset because for them, they wanted to feel that their work was valuable, and they were. And as you were saying, Jeanne, in your findings about it also being a social thing for them or a professional thing for the people who are involved in the volunteer program, they part of what they considered important part of their daily lives or their social lives was also affected. We had, I think, the best title of an article in protest came out the Christmas Day of the year that the program was ended, "Docents Painted Out of Picture." And that was the press coverage of it. But other than that, the docents, they still come to, the former docents do come to many of our gallery programs. They come to our lecture series. We're trying to find ways to engage them in the stuff that we do offer to the public, of which they can be an audience. But I would say that because it was a move to having students do the teaching, it wasn't a compromise. There was no way to be a compromise.
That seems to make sense in the context of a university art museum. That might be a slightly easier pill to swallow than if it were not. I wonder if, because many of the reasons cited for volunteers to become docents is for the social connection, and the opportunity to learn more art history if there might not be public programs that could be developed as a substitute for this group of people. If there's a desire to still serve this important population who wants to contribute to the museum, might there be another route of public programming?
Yeah, and continuing education, art history, rich content, that has been of great appeal to them, to this group that now participates in that. And I think for those who volunteer because they want to work with people, I think that's another avenue that I think is worth looking into. I'm just looking through. Go ahead. Sorry, Erin.
No, go ahead if you're going through the questions. I was going to say that an interesting point and sort of a realization I came to with working with docent programs. Docents are an audience. They're an audience that does something for you, but they are, people that you serve. And interestingly, they're like the ideal museum audience. They love everything that you do. They come to every lecture. They want to talk to. They see every special exhibition. They are just hungry for everything, and that is how you pay them, is with programming that meets those needs of theirs to provide a social outlet with people of a similar, have similar interests, and with that information, that content, and that access. Those are really hugely important things to running any docent program that are constantly, sort of constantly on our mind.
I see that Juline has been frozen out or painted out of the picture. It looks like she said that if she were to restart, she'd crash the whole session. And I noticed that we're coming up on 11 o'clock. So perhaps if there are any closing thoughts, we might offer those now. And subsequent questions, I believe we can put those onto our Google Plus page that's connected with this event. The PowerPoint data that I shared should be downloadable from there. If it's not, I will put my email there, and you can get it from me directly through that channel, and hopefully we can continue talking. I'm curious as to what are next steps. What is the next part of this conversation that we need to have? Any closing thoughts?
Hi, Erin. No, I was going to say it's a great question. I think that museums are as we become more and more visitor-centered, and this question of sort of how do you serve the public, how do you provide the facilitation to your collection, is always going to be presented to us as museum educators. What do we do? How do we do it? How best to present it? How are we going to pay for it? And there's almost always going to be a variety of answers to that, given what community you're in, the size of your institution, what resources you have. I've worked in museums across 4 different states, from teeny little towns of 60,000 to Los Angeles. It's so unique to the community and to the museum. We have sort of these models that we use, paid, unpaid, the hybrid, but everything has to be so tailored to your particular institution that's why it's great to exchange information about it, because you never know where the nugget is going to come from that works for your particular place.
And how you define what your goals are as an education department and as an institution.
And that's a huge issue. Like, since we've made this transition, it's been so fast, and we've had to sort of run. We're right now stopping and saying, let's revisit our goals. What is our mission for school programs? What are we really trying to do? And let's make sure our single visit program, multi-visit program, the way that we have things structured, how we're training our docents, that these things all are actually accomplishing those. So every once in a while, you got to stop and go back to those kind of core values.
And think about then the measurement tools that can be developed, that can be used.
How do you know you're doing it?
Sure, those goals are being met. Big questions.
And the last thing I'd add in is that to think about what capacity and what quality mean. For those whose institutions are saying, oh, we need to build capacity, we need to be able to have more and more groups come in, what really can your space accommodate? What does that mean for quality? And what does that mean in the place you are in terms of transportation, parking, all those logistics that aren't always part of the conversation? If your building can only accommodate X number of groups, that's what you have to work with, and figuring out what that means and what that means for quality, I think, is also important.
Definitely. And those have been big questions that we have grappled with.
And the last thing I would also say is to think about what the role of technology or self-guided, or not necessarily the group experience, but the individual experience with education and these different faces of those who are doing the teaching. That's one of the things we're also thinking about here is what does it look like now for those who are not part of an organized group to come in and be learning in the space, and who does it, how do they do it, and what does that mean?
Wow. Okay, I think we just planned out a whole next series.
All right.
A lot more to talk about.
Thanks everyone for
Thank you.
participating, and hopefully to those offline who are yet to partake. Thanks everyone. Bye.
Thank you.
Okay, I don't know how to turn this off.
I don't think we have the capability of making it not live.
Should we just close our browsers on 1, 2, 3? I don't know what to do. I will just close out of this.
Okay.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye. Take care, everyone. Thanks, everyone. Bye.